Hello, and welcome to the Final Ghost podcast, where we explore the intersections of horror film and feminism. In this first series, we're bringing on special guests to dive deep into film and TV shows with witchcraft at the heart of them. I'm Anna, co-founder of the Final Ghost and your podcast host. In this episode, we're diving into Mario Bava's atmospheric gothic horror Black Sunday, released in 1960 and banned in the UK until 1968 for its graphic violence. Based very, very loosely on Nikolai Gogol's story V, which incidentally also has its own Soviet film adaptation that I'd highly encourage you to check out. Black Sunday follows the wrath of the powerful witch vampire Asa, played by Barbara Steele in her first big screen role, who places a curse on her family and their descendants after they execute her for her devotion to Satan, and for being a vampire, and for being a witch, and for being too hoardy. In any case, centuries later, Asa is resurrected and aims to take the body of her descendant, the innocent young woman Katya, who is also played by Steele, who's amazing in this film. It's a glorious gothic horror classic, very big on atmosphere, and definitely one to watch in a darkened room. We actually screened this film way back in November 2019 at the lovely Prince Charles Cinema as part of our Here Be Witches season, which in turn inspired this podcast. I'm joined in this episode by film and culture writer Beatriz Loayza, who writes for such outlets as the AV Club, The Guardian, Sight and Sound, ID, and many more. So I hope you enjoy our conversation.
Nail it down. May the cleansing flames reduce her foul body to ashes, so that the wind will obliterate all trace of her existence.
Hi, Beatrice. Thanks so much for doing this with me. I'm really excited to chat to you properly about this film and in general.
Yes, I'm so excited. This is actually a film I really like.
Oh, amazing. So let's kick off there. What's your relationship with Black Sunday? When did you first see it?
I actually saw it for the first time maybe like a year or two ago. I've always kind of been into this sort of gaudy black and white gothic horror, or at least have been attracted to the aesthetic of it. And Black Sunday was just a blind spot for so long. And so I saw it for the first time a year or two ago and was just very swept up by its aesthetic and the protagonist, played by Barbara Steele, who is, I'm not sure if Scream Queen would be the right terminology.
She's definitely been called a Scream Queen. I have personally a tenuous relationship with that term, but she's been called that, even though I don't think she screams once in the film, does she?
I know. She faints, I guess. But I also have a strange relationship to that term. I don't know. Don't like using it, but I understand it like generally refers to women that are typically in horror films, are known for being in horror films.
Yeah. And since women are usually, not always, but in horror films perceived to be the victims, they're usually screaming. But yeah, sorry, we're being diverted there. But what did you think of the film rewatching it now for the purposes of this? Did your opinion on it change at all?
I have to say, my first watch, I was just kind of taken with the pleasure of watching it and the sort of classic story, the beautiful black and white. But on second watch, this is only the second time I've watched it. I was more attentive to the gender politics, which are actually quite interesting, as well as how it carves out the witch mythology in a very particular way. And so I think that it was definitely more rewarding already, going into it already knowing the plot and whatnot.
Yeah. So let's kind of set the scene. What's kind of the main arc of the story, of the narrative of Black Sunday? And who are the key characters in it?
Right. So it starts out with, I think, oh God, is it like the 17th century?
I want to say
Um,
16th, 17th century.
s- right. But anyway, it's,
Olden times.
yeah, olden times. And the witch Asa is being burnt at the stake for her treachery. It starts out with the witch Asa, who's being burnt at the stake for her evil crimes, which are kind of alluded to being of a sexual nature,
Hmm.
though the way it's described is she's fulfilling the will of Satan. Um, so she has this steel mask uh, planted on her face, and it has spikes in it. So she's killed effectively, or in a sense, and is burned at the stake. But the rain comes, and so she's not entirely burnt. And before she dies, she uh, casts a curse on her family, and so that's how it starts out. Fast forward to not the present day, really. I guess it's like the 19th century at that point. It seems like it. And we follow two doctors or two like academic types who are on their way to a conference, and they're riding by horse and buggy, and they stop and encounter this grave where, so we meet these two academics. They stumble upon the grave of Asa, and by chance, they kind of help her without knowing come back to life. In the meantime, they also encounter um, Katya, which is, also played by Barbara Steele. She's this Asa doppelganger who like comes from the same family lineage. And she lives at this creepy castle with her father and brother. And so it kind of unfolds from there. This tenuous romance with, the assistant of the main doctor. His name is Gorobetch. His romance with the innocent Katya as Asa is rising from the dead and wreaking havoc.
Thank you for that. And that first scene that you described, I mean, it's still quite striking in its violence and in, well, a number of things. But like, let's start with the violence. Do you think it's
Yeah.
because at the time it was considered extremely graphic, and it kind of pretty much, like you pointed out, equates like lust or crimes of some sort of erotic or sexual nature with witchery, and that's why Asa's being burned. Kind of, what did you make of that whole very graphic opening?
Yeah, I think it's well, one, an excellent opening because the way in which they shoot Asa receiving that punishment, which is like this brutal spiked steel mask,
Mm.
is I think there's like three or four different cuts of the same thing, but you see the mask coming onto her face from her perspective,
Mm-hmm.
um, which is, a very visceral way of presenting that, and also a way that centers her subjectivity, which is sort of interesting considering the fact that she's the villain.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but, given the fact that the movie is essentially about her wrath
Mm-hmm.
and, you know, her persecution and like her mutilation being the starting point of the movie is actually quite interesting to me because, you know, um, the idea of punishing an evil sexual woman and, this evil sexual woman being against the good man that's trying to like restore a sense of order. Um, in my mind, it's kind of associated with a sense of closure to the horror story or the story and whatnot. So that idea that it was said at the very beginning and then what follows is just like her being super angry, having this like historical anger that is ultimately impacting, generations beyond her is I think more interesting than people normally understand of this movie.
Totally. And it's also the fact that she's been punished and effectively tortured by, if I didn't misunderstand it, it's her own father who's sort of the executioner.
It's her brother.
It's her
Yeah.
brother. Yes, you're right.
Hmm. Yeah,
So it's kind of also the idea of her being the bad seed of the family.
exactly. Like as you said, she's the bad seed of the family. But then as the rest of the movie shows, there's like a version of her that's like the opposite of that. And so it kind of um, plants the seed for like the dichotomy of the evil, lusty, sexual vampire woman against the like virginal, housebound, innocent version of the same woman played by the same
Hmm.
actress.
It's interesting you bring up the word or the figure of the vampire, actually, because one of the things that struck me and that I'd sort of forgotten, and that I'd sort of forgotten until I rewatched the film again for this, was that narration at the beginning of that scene, which really equates as a both to a witch and a vampire and a devil worshipper.
Hmm.
So, kind of, what do you make of this combination of both the mythology, but also the imagery of the
Mm.
vampire film
Yeah.
and the witch film?
Yeah, it's interesting because I was reading a bit about this, and Black Sunday is considered a film where the idea of the witch and witchcraft became more of an explicit theme, and it was a more anchored source of visual horror.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like in the past, there were obviously witch renderings. I mean, there's some silent films that make reference to witches. There's um, God, the Renee Claire film, I Married a Witch, where like she's
Mm-hmm.
obviously an ambivalent character, not necessarily positive, but you're on her side. And then, throughout the 40s, there were some witch movies where they were kind of exoticized. But Mario Bava, through this, he was very consciously paying homage to the universal monster movies of the 1930s and 40s.
Yeah.
But here, the monster is this like kind of vampire witch amalgam, because, by modern standards, it's kind of uh, hard to nail or to pin down what exactly she is, though,
Mm-hmm.
in the beginning they do reference her as being a vampire, but it's, so different from
Mm-hmm.
the way we understand what constitutes a vampire today. Um, so it's a really odd hodgepodge of elements, with folkloric witchcraft elements and then like Satanism and the occult and just the general idea of the undead. Um, and, it uses images like a corpse being preserved in the grave, and then there's a resurrection via droplets of blood.
She's got like an assistant who's also sort of maybe implied to be a lover of hers, like a Renfield type
Yeah,
character.
exactly. Exactly. Um, and, the general aversion to, the cross and religious iconography.
Mm-hmm.
So it's all sorts of monster related images kind of compressed into this movie and this character and what her immunities are and powers as well.
Yeah, I found it it reminded me a lot actually of a lot of a lot of screen adaptations of Dracula, as one of, the most iconic vampires in fiction. The big creepy castle, the kind of decaying family lineage, almost all those things
Hmm.
that you mentioned. The sort of preserved corpse and kind of the care of keeping it in its grave by kind of certain rules that are sort of unwritten, but the locals know about. The fact that the locals are terrified, even that like figure when the academics are driving in of the driver of their carriage, who is very much like, I would rather just like deal with any amount of people or wild animals than deal with that witch at any point. So there's like this real sense of kind of fear in the community of her. And it actually reminded me a lot as well of Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula, which in its own right is a visual throwback to a lot of other vampire and gothic horror films anyway.
Yeah, well, I actually just read that this was a direct influence on Coppola's Dracula. So you were very perceptive about that.
Or I've watched that Dracula too many times.
Yeah, exactly.
But I wanted to pick up on something that you alluded to before. Kind of, how do you think Asa, who we meet when she's being killed, and then we only really see her as a corpse. And, Katya is a distinct character, even though both of them are played by Barbara Steele, and we'll kind of come back to her in a bit. But how does Asa's power manifest itself? Because she is sort of lording over everyone, but we don't really see her actually do much.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting because she's rather, abstractly understood as this like missionary, but for Satan. And so her powers are really abstract as well. So, she hypnotizes men and has others do her bidding. And so I guess it's like what's scary about her is she's just able to exert her control over people to do her bidding, I guess.
And I found it very interesting, the idea of like being protected against a witch. So how do you think this film sort of connects the idea of witchcraft with devil worshipping and kind of Christian iconography being used to protect the characters against her?
Right. Yeah, I'm thinking back to the beginning of the film when they are, I guess, listing what it is she did wrong. And the quote that kind of stands out to me is that she committed evil deeds to satisfy her monstrous love for Satan. And so there's that sexual element, that she is, doing stuff on behalf of this desire that she has for this evil concept thing, whatever you want to call Satan. And that, Christianity and faith and like these symbols of Christ are the only things that can stand up against this lusty satanic desire, kind of grounds it in sexuality to me.
And we mentioned it a little bit before, but it is like the Asa's presumed sexuality, or kind of those monstrous desires are kind of referenced over and over again. And the eroticism of the film was one of the things that I read was really controversial about it when it was first released. And I think in the UK it was banned for a very long time as well. So what do you make of that, of the sexual aspect of the film, and kind of especially Asa and Katya? I think it's time we bring her in because their work is such interesting. They work better in opposition to each other, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's actually, I mean, like by modern standards, it's, not that sexual, I suppose, or not that it doesn't display a lot of skin or anything like that. But, just it's very, it really highlights, I think, like the bodily reality of women, I think. Like just
Mm-hmm.
the fact that it starts out with a literal burning of a body, um the how do you call it? The striking of a face,
Yeah.
her face is ultimately ruined by this mask, and she's has these horrible like marks that
Mm.
show the wounds from that mask even in her later life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um and oh god, there's also the way that they present Katya as this victim and this virginal um you know good version of the witch. I mean, they also kind of sexualize her too. um like I recall in the scene before the two sort of transfer their life powers and Asa like sucks the strength out of Katya.
Mm-hmm.
They grab Katya and you see them kind of like rip at her shirt, and you can kind of see her chest exposed. And there's something so lurid and sensual about that, about the fact that she's going to be ravaged.
Mm.
And, even in the transference scene when Asa is sucking her life force, she is sort of moaning in pain at the fact that her life is being drained out of her, and it's kind of like an orgasm. The shot really centers on her face, and the sounds she's making are very suggestive.
Yeah, oh my God, I hadn't even thought of that. That's a really interesting reading, actually. It is always difficult, I think, in retrospect, to think about what really triggered the audiences and the censors of the time.
Mm.
Um, but I love the idea that you explored kind of her face being marked and her beauty being marred, because there is this idea that kind of keeps coming up, really associated with the figure of the witch on screen, and in
Mm.
general in fiction and in folklore, I think as well, of them being inherently deceitful creatures and often using female beauty and sensuality as kind of a mask to lure people, mostly men, in to for their, devious purposes. And
hmm
I kind of love the idea of this witch being physically prevented from tricking anyone, if you know what I mean.
hmm
Not that I love it. I love the visual, the cinematic kind of language of it. Kind of.
Yeah, and at the time, um, I think a lot of the pushback, why the film was censored at the time and not released for many years in the UK. This was a time when the idea of sexuality was being sort of utilized and mobilized as this source um, of like I don't want to say, I guess, evil, but then also just like menace and anxiety. I mean, Black Sunday was released in the same year as Peeping Tom and
Mm,
Psycho, where there's
mm,
this uh, new awareness of the ways in which a new awareness, but hyper consciousness, because I think this has existed in the past, but the ways in which uh, menace intersected with female sexuality and, just grounding it in a more tangible fear for people, I think.
mm. And kind of, do you think there's I mean, even I'm just thinking of the poster, but also a couple of the most impactful scenes in the film are really centered kind of on the horror or the violence, kind of, or the decay even being in people's faces. Like, I'm thinking not just
Mm,
of the initial scene, but also then when they take off the lid of Asa's grave and we see her, the kind of her corpse, and then
mm,
when the resurrection scene as well, and then one of her victims as well. We kind of get this, like, there's a lot of close-ups of faces.
Yeah,
And
that's right.
why do you think this centering of the horrific face, and in particular kind of Asa as this Barbara Steele as this beautiful, alluring woman who's being presented as a decrepit, quite terrifying face?
I yeah, it's an interesting thing that they decided to emphasize because, Black Sunday, the real title or the Italian title or whatnot, is The Mask of Satan. So just the idea that that faces are not just something that a person has, but they're like things to be worn and transferred. And so, the idea that within the same actress, Barbara Steele, there can be the face of a beautiful woman, but then also the image of just like a decrepit corpse within, the same individual kind of, I think, in a sense, like breaks the dichotomy of there just being separate types of women, separate types of people, and that these possibilities of like good and evil can exist within the same entity, as well as just like, the idea that, we're alive, but we can also be drained of that life and just be like a corpse. We're just bodies in a sense. But yeah, the face aspect is really striking. I think back to the I think it's one of the doctors, the like main doctor, professor person who's
Yeah.
I think Asa casts a spell on him. He becomes one of the undead, and then they like
Yeah.
find him in the grave, and his face is all disgusting. His like eyes are popping out, and I think they like they release him from the curse and like kill him by running a stake through his eye.
Yeah.
And I wonder like I don't know, when in like the history of cinema, like the rules came about in terms of like how to kill the undead or like a vampire through a stake, and like through what body parts that was the most effective through.
I think the stake definitely comes up in Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Yeah, probably.
Definitely
So
not through the eye, though.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
And what do you think? What do you make of Barbara Steele in her dual performance? This was sort of the role
Yeah,
that really put her on a map.
that's right. Yeah, this was like her breakout role, which is so interesting to me because, the idea that this was her first role and it was a dual role. That's like saying, I don't know, just like giving a first time actress the role that Lupita Nyong'o played in Us. Just like, I mean, that kind of has, I think, perhaps more psychological dimensions to it. But like still, just the idea that she was playing two, completely different characters, but that are sort of supposed to represent a unity is something really difficult to pull off, I think. But I mean, Barbara Steele is wonderful. I mean, she goes on to star in a number of Italian horror genre films, and she was in a few Roger Corman movies, Fellini's 8½, and I think she was in Shivers too, in like a supporting role, the David Cronenberg.
How do you think she plays against herself? Because we kind of mentioned already several times that Asa is like presented as this figure of pure evil and implicitly lust, or even quite explicitly considering the times. But and then Katya is like this virginal figure of purity. And
Right.
I found it really weird that they even mentioned how old she was. know, she's 21, and
Oh, is she?
how sad it is that, you know, she's gonna quote unquote go to waste because she's so young and so beautiful, and oh my god, let's not let her die because that would be a tragedy. Which I kind of thought a bit weird, but they only interact once. And I was wondering what you thought of that scene when Katya is confronted with Asa.
It's so different because Asa is very strong-willed, to like say it in an understated way. And you know, she's driven by this desire, this like need to fulfill the will of Satan, and to have things under her control, as she sort of set them out to be when she first cast the initial curse. And so that meeting this like completely obedient household woman, Katya, who, to add a bit of nuance to her character, who's, I think, carries the curse of her family in a very melancholy way. So she's not just like a cheery household nun type person. She's clearly heavy with some sort of, you know, history that she feels in her bones, and like that kind of prophesizes the eventual tragedy that will befall her and her family. And I guess there's that corporeal way in which she like almost senses it. Like you can just kind of sense it through her manner of being, and her kind of, yeah, just like her melancholy but beautiful present, like way of presenting herself, which is, I think, what attracts one of the doctors to her. So I don't know, just the idea of these two things coming together, and you know, obviously Asa would be able to take advantage of this weaker version of herself, and you know, the fact that these other men rally around Katya to try to protect her. They see this necessity to protect Katya and her innocence and her sadness and her beauty, which is, you know, kind of funny because she's kind of the same person as Asa.
Yeah.
But like what happened to Asa in the beginning is like the complete opposite of like needing to save her.
There was something that really struck me about their face-to-face confrontation when Asa sort of hisses at Katya that the love that the young man had for you could have saved you, but I was stronger.
You did not know that you were born for this moment. You didn't know that your life had been consecrated to me by Satan. But you sensed it, didn't you? You sensed it, didn't you? That's why my portrait was a constant temptation to you. Why it frightened you. You felt that your life and your body were mine. You felt like me because you were destined to become me. A useless body without life. The love that young man had for you could have saved you. Do you know that? You might have been happy together, but I was stronger, and now you shall enjoy a beautiful life of evil and hate in me.
I wonder if you, especially kind of on this rewatch for the purposes of this, if you had any thoughts about how the dynamic between the male protagonist and the female protagonist and antagonist, played by the same woman, it'll get confusing, but kind of how that plays out across the film.
Yeah, I was definitely like less taken with the love story that's sort of shoehorned in there. For me, just because, I mean, like, I understand they needed this sort of abstract thing to go against Asa, who like represents hate. And so like, you know, they create this tenuous romance between Katya and then this professor guy, Gorobetch, or whatever his name is, to be the sort of the counterpoint, like the way of defeating this witch. But it's interesting because I didn't really find that to be too believable. I mean, it's like they fall in love. He like sees Katya from a distance with like these cool dogs. And And then they like just fall in love passionately, I guess, over the course of 2 days. And I just feel like they didn't really do much to, I guess, create that powerful romance that could resist, the scourge of Satan that Asa represents. So, I mean, that was a bit slim to me.
Yeah, I mean, movie magic. I'm there with you. In very few of older horror films, I find the shoehorned romance to be believable. This one in particular just seemed like the guy was just quite taken with her beauty and her melancholic nature. Like it was something that he could save. She seemed to me very much like a damsel in distress that needed saving by the male figures in her life. And that's in a very and this is not aligned with my own thinking at all, but that's alluring to those male characters in the film, where it's like, oh
Yeah.
we need to kill the witch bitch and then we can marry the pretty girl who can live in the pretty castle.
There's no love for the good girl. I mean, she just doesn't have anything to do. She's literally just, I mean, Katya is, I mean, just like a vessel that Asa hopes to occupy one day.
Yeah.
Or she's just like something that needs to be protected by these guys. But I don't even understand what she is. Like any moment in which she like really exerts any sort of agency or I don't know, matters for like the sake of herself almost.
Yeah. I do love Barbara Steele's performance in this. I find it amazing that she can project such entirely different personas, and that I at least kind of could have such kind of intense reactions to both of her personas and both of her performances within the same film.
Definitely. Yeah, she's really amazing in it.
And she does have some really cool dogs in that one shot.
Have you seen The Invisible Man yet?
Yeah.
Okay, there's like a part at the end when Elizabeth Moss comes out after
Yes.
She comes out with a dog that looks a lot like Katya's dog in that scene, and I always think of the two.
Oh my God, you're so right. And
yes.
Kind of bringing it a little bit back to witches, how do you think this film fits into what I've been calling the witch canon?
The witch canon. Let's see. I mean, it's kind of hard for me to situate it because it's kind of like the early instance, or one of the earliest instances in which we're really kind of getting a handle on what sort of menace the witch is. And the witch as a monster that's, all powerful and seeking revenge, and the antithesis to, I guess, humanity and the goodness in humanity and, humanity without sex. So, I mean, I guess for me, it really grounds the witch canon in the idea that that the witch figure is the opposite of the like virginal woman, that she is full of agency to do what she wants, and what she wants is usually bad and kind of sexual.
That's quite interesting. Yeah, because it also kind of quite directly pits her against a more traditional image of femininity. I do find it quite radical that it's played by the same woman. So there's sort of, their type of beauty is exactly the same.
Yeah, I think it really reveals the illusory nature of, this dichotomy between the lusty woman and then the obedient one.
I don't know. I'm just thinking out loud now, but in a way, she's sort of, her sinfulness is kind of defined by the men around her.
Yeah, exactly. It's just all kind of abstract, the idea that it's like Satan against religion. Like, what exactly does that mean? Like, how exactly is she being bad? And the fact that it's, her sexuality and that lustiness that they describe her as, that being the source of the thing that's being opposed by like these Puritan men is kind of revelatory.
How so?
I mean, I hate to say it's like a film about the patriarchy. I want to like break that down a bit. Just like throwing the word patriarchy around. I mean, it's revelatory because it, reveals the ideal of what a woman should look and act like, against the woman that's seen as taboo, as breaking the rules, as going against how men are expecting her to act, which is, probably being under their command or more obedient to like how they want her to act and function within a society.
Where do you see its impact on cinema and the portrayal of witches the most?
Yeah, I mean, that sort of blending of folklore and witchcraft and like the occult. I mean, these are elements that became pretty quickly reprised, I think, in Rosemary's Baby, for instance. And I mean, we talked about Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula and sort of the new vampire films that were coming out around the time and much later, which were, I think that, the modern vampire film is, extremely sexual. Or the way that it's evolved is extremely sexual and, hyper stylized. And, I think that Black Sunday, had to have contributed in a sense to that dichotomy between, the non-vampire as being like, normal, not into freaky sex and like blood and stuff. And then like the vampire is this sort of outsider, outcast, kind of punk figure, which is, what Asa is all about in a sense. I mean, she's the outsider. She's literally burnt at the stake. So, I mean, Black Sunday is definitely one of those films that grounded that idea down. But I feel like the vampire and witch in general, in lighter ways, I'm sure, have always been a way of understanding the other, typically the other women.
I think I'm not sure if it was the first one. It's definitely one of the earliest films, horror films about witches, at least, that sort of starts at the end where you see the witch being defeated, but then the whole film is actually about her revenge. And I've always found it quite interesting to start at the end of the story and actually then make the presumed villain, or straight up the villain of the film, of the story, actually in a way the victim. And yeah, sure, they're bad and all of that, and they're evil and cavorting with Satan and want to destroy lives and shit, but also we actually first up meet them at their lowest point. And I instantly kind of think of Hocus Pocus even.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it's kind of sad because you see the brutality she's met with in the beginning of the film, and it's seeing it from her point of view also heightens um, or makes us relate more to the fact that she's rightfully angry.
And this idea as well of a woman's wrath, I find really interesting.
Yeah, especially against her own family. You
Yeah.
know, this family that wanted her to behave and correspond to, I guess, their idea of the family dynasty or like the
Mm,
family lineage. And she
mm.
just rejects that, falls in love with, I guess, Satan, and is ultimately repudiated from her family in a very bombastic way.
And they're so, even, what is it, 2 centuries after she is killed, still not apologetic about it at all.
Yeah, I wonder what she would have done if she had won in the end.
Yeah, I kind of also would like to see what she did to merit that treatment, that punishment, more like.
Hmm. Yeah, they're very vague about it. Just like,
Yeah.
she's lusty, she was a vampire, she's a danger to people. Um, Unclear.
Yeah, that's the prequel that I want to see.
Exactly.
Beatrice, thank you so much for your time and for your insights on the film as well. Where can people find out more about your work?
So you can follow me on Twitter at BEA Loayza, and links to my work at a number of outlets. I'm a freelance writer, can be found on my website, which is just beatriceloayza.com.
Perfect. Thanks so much.
Yes, no problem. It was a pleasure.
And that's it for another episode of the Final Ghost podcast. Please do rate and subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find out more about what we do on thefinalghost.co.uk and follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at The Final Ghost UK. Let us know what you think about the podcast and the Witch series so far by leaving us a review. It really helps, especially as an independent podcast. You can also get in touch with us with whatever else is on your mind on hello@thefinalghost.co.uk. You can follow Beatrice on Twitter at BEA Loayza, and I am on Anna Be Demented. Thank you for listening, and stay tuned for more witchy goodness next week.